Welcome to Dr. Lottie Science with Soul. I'm Dr. Lottie and the host of this podcast. Today, I am so excited to introduce Beth O'Hara. Beth O'Hara is a functional naturopath specializing in complex chronic cases of Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, Histamine Intolerance, and Mold Toxicity. She is the founder and clinical director of Mast Cell 360, a functional naturopathy practice designed to look at all factors surrounding health conditions: genetic, epigenetic, biochemical, physiological, environmental, and emotional. She designed Mast Cell 360 to be the kind of practice that she wished had existed when she was severely ill with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, Histamine Intolerance, Mold Toxicity, neural inflammation, Lyme, Fibromyalgia, and chronic fatigue. Her mission today is to be a guiding light for others with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, Histamine Intolerance, and these related conditions in their healing journeys. She developed the MC360 method, which is used exclusively by the practitioners at Mast Cell 360 to build personalized, effective roadmaps for healing. Her method has now helped thousands of people with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, Mold Toxicity, and sensitivities to regain their lives, their hopes, and their dreams. She holds a doctorate in Functional Naturopathy, a master's degree in Marriage and Family Therapy, and bachelor's degree in Physiological Psychology. She is certified in Functional Genomic Analysis and is a research advisor for the Nutrigenic Research Institute. She presents at functional medicine conferences on Mast Cell Activation Syndrome and Mold Toxicity, as well as the use of genetics and biochemistry in addressing chronic health conditions. So welcome, Beth. It's such an honor to have you as a guest today.
Thank you. It's really my honor. I've been looking forward to this. And I find again and again that this conversation can be a game changer for people who are going from specialist to specialist and they're really struggling. And it seems like, Dr. Lottie, that so many people who are energetically sensitive have more vulnerability around our physical health. And that's another reason why I think this might help your listeners.
Yeah, it's fascinating how complex we are. And Western medicine tends to just look at the physical body, but they forget the spiritual and the emotional component. And I always tell people, if you're really going to heal, you have to work on all three. And it's not an either or, because sometimes you have spiritual people saying, I don't want to do any Western medicine. I don't want to do anything. And I tell them, well, you live in the physical world. Let's use all the things that we can use to create healing. And I know you had a significant health journey and you were severely ill with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome. And can you share with the listeners some of your journey and what happened?
Sure. It can be kind of hard to talk about, one, because it feels like it was a different life from the one I live now. It was a different life. And two, it was painful. But I find that in sharing it, a lot of times it gives people hope that if they were as sick as I was, they also can get well. So when I was younger, quite young, about 7, we moved into an old farmhouse. And I had a few things before then. I kind of had ADD. I'd get in trouble in school a lot. I couldn't sit in my seat. Those things would go on. And this was before ADD was a real much of a diagnosis. So fortunately, I wasn't put on any meds for it. But everything really changed after we moved to this old farmhouse. And for me at the time, it was an adventure. It was like Laura Ingalls Wilder, and we were living out in the country. But this old farmhouse really needed a lot of fixing up, and we knew nothing about toxic mold. We just thought, oh, it's mold. Well, that's a cleaning issue. Like you just had to keep cleaning it, And I was bitten by ticks quite a lot. We were playing out in the fields and in the woods, and it was common to have tick bites. And then, so I'd had just a handful of things happen, but I was still staying ahead of it all. When I was 9, I was kicked in the head by a horse and had a traumatic brain injury. And I was unconscious for a long time, a long time relatively, about half an hour. And I left my body, actually crossed over, and then was not happy to come back. And at that point realized this is a life of suffering. This is a world of suffering, which I was really oblivious to before then. And the head injury tipped off all kinds of things. I had severe insomnia, horrible anxiety, social anxiety. I dreaded going to school. I loved academics, but I lost my ability to socialize and communicate. And today I might have been diagnosed as on the Asperger's side of the autism spectrum, even though that usually you see that early in. That's what my behavior was like. I started having hives head to toe, and growing up in the country, you a lot of times do things like grow lots of green beans that have to be picked and snapped for canning. And it was my job to feed the chickens corn and the corn feed, and I would end up covered head to toe in hives. The kind where I would scratch my skin till I bled. And, it was just my eyes itching, all those just allergy symptoms, but not mild. I mean, we're talking like I would rub my eyes until they were huge and swollen. And I started in with exercise-induced asthma. I mean, just kept snowballing. I did make it through school, though, and somehow pushed into college. And I was en route to go to medical school. I wanted to become a neurologist. And that was my only goal in this Aspergery way that I had at the time. I was all I wanted was Grey's Anatomy for my 16th birthday. I like to go out in the fields and find bleached skeletons, and I would try to reassemble them. So I was pretty serious about going to medical school. But my health kept crashing. And by my senior year, I could barely function. And I knew I had a full scholarship, a couple offers for medical school. And I knew if I made it somehow through the course load, I would never make the 80-hour-a-week residency. In some ways, it was a gift that I didn't go, because I would have been a very traditional medicine by the book physician. And it changed my life, my health issues, not in the way I wouldn't have chosen it, but it did change my life. And when I couldn't go to medical school, I didn't have a backup plan. I actually ended up teaching yoga, which got me to, over time, love and appreciate my body, which I was abusing terribly and not taking care of. And I started with traditional medicine and exhausted everything that they had to offer. And more often than I got help, I was told that everything was in my head, that I was crazy. I had severe debilitating menstrual cycles that had started very young at 13. I would be flattened for 3 or 4 days. I couldn't function, extreme pain. And by the time I was 28, I was walking with a cane. I could barely hobble to the bathroom. It was like walking on ground glass. My friends were dancing. I was wearing orthopedic shoes and Doc Martens because that's all I could handle. And I'd have to use little scooters when I'd go to the grocery. And I probably should have been in a wheelchair, but I was too stubborn. And then the real game changer came. I mean, I just kept going somehow. This was before we had functional medicine when I started out, but I could get to homeopathy, and there was holistic medicine, there was integrative medicine. I exhausted all of that. I became so sensitive, I couldn't take anything. I couldn't tolerate medications. I couldn't tolerate opening capsules and starting with little bits of supplements. Curcumin would make me more inflamed. GABA would make me anxious. Quercetin would make my sleep worse. None of it made any sense. And we knew by the time I was 30, I had Lyme, Bartonella, and Babesia. Nobody figured the mold piece out, though. And functional medicine kind of started in around this time frame. I'm in my mid 40s. But there was no telehealth, so it was who you could get to. And the best functional medicine doctor I had seen at this point, I was around practitioner 75, and I stopped counting. And after working together for 3 years, he said, "Beth, you've tried everything I've asked you to try. Nothing's worked." And he actually knew what mast cell activation was. I'd figured out I had histamine issues, and I figured out oxalate issues, and then figured out the mast cell issues. He's like, "Oh yeah, I heard of that," before we had diagnostic criteria for it. And he said, I don't know what else to do. I'm so sorry. And that had to have been hard to tell me. And it was much harder to hear. And I drove all the way home and sobbed and had a meltdown. And I had many meltdowns on this journey, but that was a big one because I thought, if he doesn't know? Who's going to know? Who's going to help me with this? I felt terrified. I felt alone. I didn't know if I was going to survive. I was so sick. I mean, just to get to his office, it'd take me a week to recover. And I was mostly bedridden at this point. And I just woke up the next morning and realized I knew there was an answer to this. I knew it in my bones. I didn't know if I'd figure it out in time, but I knew it was out there. And I didn't know who knew. But I decided, well, I have this pre-med background, and the times that my brain clicks, I can follow research papers. So I started reading everything I get my hands on. Some days my brain fog was so bad, all I could make it through was one sentence or two sentences. But I just started piecing things together. And when I realized the mold toxicity piece, that was a huge part, but I still can tolerate how to detox. So the next big realization was that, gosh, I've done all this meditation, I've done all this yoga, but I haven't addressed these main parts of my nervous system, the limbic system, the vagal nerve, that are so involved in sensitivities. And I was down to 10 foods at this point, and I'm really underweight. That was getting serious. So I started working on this kind of nervous system retraining. And over time, I somehow stumbled into this microdosing technique of taking the tiniest dusting into water, stirring water, and taking a little sip of something. And I gradually built myself up to where I would make myself this little sludge, and I'd have 20 different things. I'd put the tiniest dusting in. And, it took me 2 years to get to that, but it kept expanding, and I just kept going. And then when my nervous system got well enough that I could start to detox, I started detoxing the mold. And over time, I just got better, and better. Today, I can wear heels if I want. I don't wear them for a long time, but I have a collection of heels. That was very healing for me since I missed out on all of that. And I can travel. I can eat out. I have too many food options now. I have to watch my weight. And eat in restaurants, no problem. Good restaurants. I don't eat fast food. That would still really hurt me. And I don't want to go back to that. I can exercise. I can go hiking. I have a really full life. I got my brain back and went back to graduate school and built the practice. And here I am today.
Wow, that's quite the journey. So many things going on, and nobody really understood what you were going through, because it's so often missed in Western medicine, as we don't really get training in MCAS, Lyme, or mold, right? So you go to the doctor, and that is so terrible. And then the gaslighting of it's all in your head, and here you are fighting all these different ailments. So, so how is Mast Cell Activation Syndrome, or MCAS, and histamine related? And you can expand on that into mold if you want, how it gets involved if you have mold toxicity.
Sure. So I know you had Tanya Dempsey on, which I just love, and she's a colleague and a friend, and I love her work. So I know she probably did a great job going in depth. For people who didn't catch that, just to catch them up and hit the highlights, first we have to know what mast cells are. So these are frontline defending and sensing cells of the immune system, and they're really critical. And I think of them as, if not the most complex cell, one of the most complex cells in our bodies. And they're really long-lived cells. They live over a year, which is a long time for a cell. And they have all these receptors on the outside that can sense things. They have over 200 types of receptors, which is amazing. 200 types, not just receptors, but types of receptors. So the receptors for histamines, they have receptors for cytokines that people have been hearing about now, and these cell messengers and signaling molecules. They have receptors for hormones, for injury, all this stuff in our bodies, for viruses, for other types of pathogens like bacteria, parasites, molds, candida. They have receptors for all kinds of chemicals, and a lot of medications work on the different mast cell receptors. Opioids, for example, actually, as problematic as they can be, stabilize mast cells, and a number of different things will. They have 4 types of histamine receptors. And if we really drill it down, what they're looking for is, are we being exposed to toxins? Are we being exposed to pathogens? Are we being exposed to stressors? And stressors can be physical, like an injury or a physical trauma or surgery. It can be emotional stressor, a spiritual stressor, all of that. Well, how in the world are they responding to these emotional, mental receptors? We have to, or factors, we have to know that mast cells are found in every tissue in the body except the retina. And they have a huge role in the nervous system. And they line every nerve sheath, and they're found at every nerve ending. And then they're also in the heart, muscles. They're in the lungs. They're in the whole GI tract, from the mouth all the way through the intestines. They're in the trachea and the lungs. They're in the brain. They are in the muscles. They're made in the bone marrow and migrate through the bone marrow. They're in the blood vessel lining. They're all through the skin, all of the mucosal tissue in the sinuses and around the eyes and the ears, everywhere. And then they have over 1,000 mediators inside of them, which is just incredible how they have these 1,000 different chemicals. So histamine's the best known of them, and they do produce this whole class of cytokines they use for signaling, and they can, it's a whole cell communication network, immune cell communications. And they produce also neurotransmitters and neuropeptides. They have a continual crosstalk with the nervous system. So that's important for people to know in terms of how we address mast cells. And they literally can respond to every thought. They are sensing and responding to every thought we have. This is really important in terms of when we have mast cell issues, how we address our mental and emotional health that you were talking about before, and our spiritual health. And really what they're doing is looking for safety. Are we safe? And constantly, are we safe now? Am I safe now? Am I safe now? And if we're not safe because of a stressor, because of a pathogen, because of a toxin, their job is to create inflammation to help respond to that. And that's important. And a lot of times people think of inflammation as being all bad, but we know inflammation is really important in the healing process. And even just getting a cold, all the sinus and the throat inflammation, or these cells like mast cells and the other cells creating that protective response. Or when we get injured, we get that inflammation, and the mast cells are producing that to help the healing process. And then in a normal mast cell, it'll just calm back down, and you go on your way, and you forget that you had a cold in June of 2022, or you don't remember, oh yeah, in April of 1996 I twisted that ankle. We just get on with it, and we don't think about it. And what's happened is that we live in this world that is toxic at levels that we've never experienced before, on every level. Physically toxic in terms of chemicals, emotionally toxic, politically toxic, our lifestyles themselves and how much stress the average person has is extraordinarily toxic. The way that we get up and we rush all day, and we're trying to get the kids handled, and the kids have 6 extracurricular activities, and they never get to play. We don't get to rest, just trying to get dinner on the table, and there's no time to breathe all day. I have people telling me, I don't have time to spend 15 minutes meditating. I'm like, well, if that's your life, you don't have time not to spend 15 minutes breathing and rebooting your nervous system, however we do it. So that's the state that we're in. And it's like these mast cells are the guards of the castle gate of the body. And they're linked arm in arm with the nervous system, particularly that vagal and limbic pieces we talked about before. And their job is to protect us, but then they should be able to go off duty and restore themselves. And just like if we were security guards and we had to be on duty 24/7, our mast cells have a constant onslaught. And we haven't talked about EMFs yet. So we have EMFs, mold toxicities at epidemic levels, Lyme's at epidemic levels, these tick-borne infections. And there's a new Lyme species now every 1 to 2 years, a Lyme species. So our immune system can't even keep up. And then we've got these, this pandemic we came out of, we got these novel viruses, all this stuff happening. Ice caps are melting and releasing viruses that we haven't been exposed to in 10,000 years. So all of that means that these mast cells it's like they're in battle 24/7, and that's how they get dysregulated. When they get dysregulated, they become overly sensitive. Their receptors are overly sensitive, and they might become sensitive to foods that should be just fine. People who have mast cell responses to broccoli. And it's like, broccoli, why? Well, the mast cells triggered that because they've lost their fine tuning. They can't tell anymore. The sensors aren't clear anymore. And then they over-release these inflammatory mediators. And the symptoms people get depend on the permutations of which mast cells in which location, which receptors are oversensitive, and which mediators are being released, and what do those mediators do. So that's why this has been so mystifying for so long, because there's hundreds and hundreds of presentations. Now, going back to, I was just set the stage to answer the question, which was mast cells and histamine intolerance. So mast cell activation syndrome is really about the mast cells themselves and having this inappropriate, dysregulated response to things that creates multisystemic inflammation. So if there's inflammation in 2 or more systems, it's worthwhile looking at. So it would be, do you have gut symptoms and brain symptoms? Do you have heart palpitations and you've got urinary urgency and burning? All kinds of things that can show up. Do you have lung issues, trouble breathing, you get tightness in your chest, and you've got muscle and joint pain? It's worth looking at. Any form of autoimmunity and many forms of cancer have been linked. So these are all worth looking more at mast cell activation syndrome where we see those. Histamine intolerance commonly co-appears, is slightly different. It's related though. Histamine intolerance is when we just have issue with histamine, and we're not looking at the 999 other plus mast cell mediators. So if we just have trouble with histamine, this could be because the mast cells are over-releasing, and the 2 other cells that release histamine, they could be dysregulated and over-releasing. Or it can be because we're over-consuming histamine in high histamine foods like strawberries, pineapple, walnuts, cashews, peanuts, fermented foods, wine, beer, things like lunch meats, fish that's been sitting at the fish counter that wasn't frozen after slaughter, canned fish, canned foods in general. When I started in really taking care of my health in my early 20s, and I decided I got to clean up my diet. First thing I did was got the sugar out and improved my sugar because my blood sugar was terrible and I had to eat every 2 hours. And then the next thing I did was join the Weston A. Price movement, which is a wonderful movement on traditional eating, but they do a lot of ferments, and my kitchen looked like a little laboratory with all the kimchi bubbling and the sauerkraut I was making and the sourdough bread and the kefir. And I didn't realize I had made histamine city. And so my itching, it was worse. My rashes, my eczema were all worse. I had a lot of diarrhea, it was worse. All this stuff happening. Sleep was worse. Anxiety was worse. I get all this flushing. So those are some symptoms of histamine intolerance. There are a lot of others, but that's how it can look. The symptoms of histamine intolerance completely overlap with mast cell activation syndrome, though. And I'll talk about how you can tell the difference here in a second. So we talked about influx, which is you can overproduce it from your mast cells, and the other 2 cells are the basophils and the eosinophils, or you can overconsume it, so the input. And I think of this like a sink metaphor. The sink, the faucet is the flow of histamine, either from the cells or the food we're eating. And then the drain are the enzymes that break the histamine down. There's lots of enzymes. The 2 that are most talked about are DAO, diamine oxidase made in the small intestine, HNMT, histamine and methyltransferase, and that's dependent on the methylation pathway. And then there's a variety of others that aren't usually talked about. But if those enzymes, for various reasons, things like mold toxicity, things like Lyme, can be things like GI inflammations. We've got some SIBO, so that's going to affect our DAO production. Nutrient depletions will affect our ability to make those enzymes or activate them. Anything that can affect that production of those enzymes, it can affect how much histamine, the rate histamine can be broken down to get it out of the body. So then when that happens, it's like the drain gets clogged and the sink starts to overfill. So you can have an issue on either side or both sides, the inflow or the outflow. And one telltale sign is that not everybody gets this with histamine issues, but waking between 2 and 4 a.m. and the body collects all the histamine from the day in the tissues. And then between 2 and 4 a.m., there's a dumping of histamine into the bloodstream and it gets cleared through the liver. And then if there's too much, that will wake people up. That may not be the only reason, but if that's the 2 to 4 a.m. waking, some people it's 3 to 5 a.m., that's a good time to at least take a look at it. So how do you know if it's histamine intolerance or mast cell activation syndrome or both? If it's just histamine intolerance, the case is usually way less complex. And lowering histamine foods and eating low histamine, I have people just do a 6-week low histamine trial. And if you're going to do this, please get a really good list, because 95% of lists out there, unfortunately, have tons of errors in them. And I think they just copy the errors from one to another. And that can mess your trial up if you're like, oh, but that said it was fine to eat fish at the fish counter. And now I'm bumping my histamine way up and I can't tell. So you want to have a good list. And we've got a list on our website. Janice Chernaja is a real expert in this field. There's a Swiss list called the SIGI list. Some of these are SIGHI, some of the best lists out there. And then after 6 weeks, if the symptoms have improved greatly, it's clear you have histamine intolerance. If there's not a lot of improvement though, we're not sure, then we don't just say, oh, well, it's not there. We do a challenge. Now, this is to say for somebody who doesn't have anaphylaxis or isn't severely ill. If somebody's severely ill or gets anaphylaxis, don't do this challenge because you don't want to risk going into that. But if you have room for it and you're like, okay, I can handle some hives or some itching again, it's not going to hurt me or put me in the ER, then we do 3 days of pigging out on high histamine foods. So we're going to do like pineapple and strawberries and get some, whatever you like, sausages or those kinds of things that are high histamine. Look at the list and see. And I try to separate out when we do that trial, think foods that were like high oxalate or really high salicylate if we're not sure about those for somebody. And then if those symptoms come back, clearly we have a histamine issue. If it's only histamine intolerance, staying with the low histamine diet for a while and then supporting the histamine degrading enzymes nutritionally and supporting the gut will usually handle it. Sometimes there may be things like estrogen dominance that has to be addressed, but usually you can be done within 6 to 8 months and it's not hard. And then people can go back on their lives and they can figure out their threshold for histamine foods. And they may find they need some DAO when they eat those, but they can manage it and it's pretty easy. Some people have mast cell activation syndrome without histamine intolerance. So we do this histamine trial, don't notice anything. We do the challenge, don't notice anything. And they can eat histamine foods and not have a flare of their mast cell symptoms. I've seen maybe 5 of those in my practice. So there's sure a lot more out there. They just don't make their way into my door, my virtual door. And most of the people I see have both. And that makes the case more complex. And mast cell activation syndrome with histamine intolerance, we may get some improvement with these histamine reducing methods, but there's going to be a lot more layers. And it's going to take us 2 to 4 years to work through that. And people get huge recoveries, but it's just not as quick and easy as if it's just histamine intolerance. Did that help explain it? Did that make it clear?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great explanation. The MCAS and the histamine response. Now, if most people tend to have both, right? That's what you said.
At
Some
least
people will
I
respond.
see.
Yeah,
I don't
yeah,
have a population study, so I don't know what's, out there beyond what
yeah.
I've.
And some of the symptoms you mentioned, the hives and stomach upset. What are some? Could somebody have MCAS but maybe have neurological issues from MCAS?
Yes, especially again, this role of the nervous system is absolutely key in understanding and addressing MCAS. So a lot of times we'll see things like we'll see nerve pains, we'll see heart palpitations, and then people spend all this time with the cardiologist. I'm glad they're getting screened and making sure there's not something structurally wrong with the heart. But most of the time they don't find anything. And then they're told they're crazy, or they're fortunately people are getting more compassionate. So they're told, I'm sorry, I just don't know. They may be put on things like beta blockers and all kinds of stuff like that when it's really a vagal nerve signaling issue. And anytime remembering that all these nerves are completely lined with mast cells, if your mast cells are pumping out inflammation, those nerves are going to be dysregulated. They're signaling because they're getting the signs, danger, danger, danger. So if we're in danger, yeah, your heart rate's going to speed up or be all over the place, just like if you're being chased by a bear. That's what the body's responding, how the body's responding. We'll see other things too, like POTS, so postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, where blood pressure, you get these big changes, usually drops, and particularly from going from sitting or lying down to standing. This is where people are like, oh, I stood up too fast, I'm dizzy. That is often an electrolyte and vagal nerve issue. Not solely and not exclusively, but those are some of the biggest triggers for those. But we also see neurologically things like anxiety, depression, brain fog, sleep issues are very, very common. Trying to think what else. That's what's coming to mind right now. Is that the direction you were thinking?
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking of, sometimes people have different symptoms. So they'll have anxiety or panic, and then they go to the doctor and then they're given anti-anxiety medication. Now, if people have those kinds of symptoms and they end up in your lab, what treatment would you just go after the whole symptoms, the diet and different supplements, and or how would you go about treating somebody like that?
After working with a lot of people and scouring for years, everything, because when I started looking at this, there was nothing written other than studies in the theoretical phases of MCAS. There were no books, there was nothing. And this is how we learned, was seeing what was working for people. And then I started developing a method, and then have gotten to experience how it's worked with people and refined and fine-tuned it. So in this method, and I call it the MC360 method, we start, whether we're talking about this experience, we're talking about somebody with GI issues, everything gets individualized, but the big order of operations is what's so important. So we wouldn't certainly jump into antidepressants. We'd actually start with nervous system work targeted to the limbic and vagal system. And then the other piece we always look at is there anything structurally going on that might be putting pressure on these cranial nerves that are so important in how the whole system responds? So there is the top vertebrae out, so that's putting pressure on the vagal nerve. So if that's the case, you can do all the signaling work you want. If the nerve is pinched, not going to fix it. It's really helpful for people to do that for a few weeks to a couple months and see what happens with their symptoms. It's remarkable for some people what happens. I tell everyone that this is at least 50% of the healing process is the nervous system piece. And again, it's about coming to safety, feeling deeply safe again. And for some people, that really improves their sleep, their anxiety, their depression, their GI tract, all kinds of stuff. And then we see how far does that get us. And we start to bring in some mast cell supports. Sometimes just calming the mast cells. Now, they may be targeted mast cell supports. There are hundreds of mast cell supports because they're so complex. And everybody should know, too, that there is no single one mast cell supplement, even a combo supplement, because we've got 1,000 mediators. We've got 200 receptors. We need a synergy. And that synergy seems to be unique for every person. But we start building that based on what they're experiencing. So we might target things for neural inflammation with anxiety and panic. We might target things if it seems like it's a high glutamate situation. The brain goes really fast, won't turn off. There's ADD kind of symptoms. We might modulate that. Or we might support serotonin and things like that. And then if that's still not getting it, the other thing at this phase we're doing is cleaning up triggers, food triggers. What's the diet look like? Hopefully people have stopped sugar, gluten, and dairy. Those are all going to inflame the neurological system. We're checking on environmental triggers. Mold, are we living in mold? That's going to constantly keep the brain on fire and the limbic system triggered in this fight or flight because we're smelling mold, whether you register you smell it or not. The nerve that goes straight to this limbic system controlling fear and safety and emotion is directly linked to the nerve in the nose, the olfactory nerve. So we're looking at those things. Also VOC. Some people move right into a new house and then they got sick. Like, well, that house is going to off-gas for 2 years. So what's our air quality? So I think about pure water, pure air, pure food. And then if that's not getting us, we'll get even more refined on, like in the example of anxiety, panic, more refined on the neurotransmitters. Sometimes people do need some meds. I'm not anti-med at all. Often by the time people make it into our practice, they need a combination of supplements, natural approaches, and some medication because they're in bad shape. They're in bad situation. And they don't have time to wait a year for supplements we're turning around a cruise ship at this point. So, supplements are going to take them 3 years. They don't have 3 years. And I don't prescribe, but I often advise and work with their prescribers, their medical team. So does that give you some ideas?
Yeah, no, it's interesting. So if they have MCAS and then they start these supplements or a medication, do you see that they often react to like the fillers in the supplements or the medication? It's good intentions. Maybe they go to the doctor and they give them a medication, but then they actually react to it instead of getting better.
It's very common. We have to be really careful about what we're looking at. And some of the major triggers that are in these inactive ingredients in medications and supplements are titanium dioxide. We see that even in pharmaceutical grade, and you'll see that in foods. And that's a major GI mast cell disruptor. It's a whitener and makes things look nicer. So people are like, oh, this is nice and pure because otherwise it'd be gray and I wouldn't want to swallow it. But it's very disruptive to our guts when we have mast cell issues. Talc is a big one. It's very toxic. Cornstarch for some people, not everybody. Dyes in particular, I don't recommend anyone with MCAS use dyes, anything with dyes in it. I've got a handful of people with MCAS that just don't seem really sensitive, but most of the ones we work with are sensitive to things. And then there's some preservatives that you find in the liquids, potassium sorbate and sodium benzoate. Particularly, we find those in compounded liquids. So people might get a compound LDN as a liquid, low-dose naltrexone, or ketotifen might be prescribed as a liquid. We have to really watch for those types of things that can get people, because then it's not a fair trial. You don't actually know if it helped or not. So keeping things really clean. People usually avoid the liquids because they have a short shelf life without those preservatives, and get capsules, and they can be, people tolerate cellulose, that's used a lot. Sometimes baking soda is used, particularly if blood pressure is low. And that could be helpful if that doesn't interfere with the absorption of that particular medication. We've got to check the supplements too. I check every inactive ingredient on everything we use.
Why is it that some people get MCAS. Do we know that, or do you see a trend in your practice why some people develop that?
Oh, I do see some trends. So some of it seems to depend on amount of trauma. Trauma is huge in this population, and the more trauma, the more nervous system work we need. But a lot of people have trauma. I would say probably 75-80% of people in my practice have had some significant early traumas. There can be things like mold toxins and Lyme and Bartonella can pass through gestation, through the placenta. The mold toxins for sure pass through the breast milk. So how much toxicity was there? The generation. So we get children now who've been really ill since birth. And we know that toxins are found in the cord blood of children, and we're not starting at the same starting point we were 50 or 100 years ago. There's also some of it's mindset. So how anxious do we get about our symptoms and spiral into it? And then that's going to tell the mast cells I'm in more danger. So how much can we calm that back down? And then there's a piece of intergenerational trauma. I've had people who had no childhood trauma of their own, but I particularly see this quite a lot in people with Ashkenazi heritage and Native American, other places where people were just exposed to awful atrocities, even 2, 3, 4 generations back. And I think there's an energetic signature with all of that passes, or that we can inherit somehow. I don't know exactly how that works, but some people who are incredibly sensitive and been really stuck have gotten great steps forward with working with somebody who's very well trained in energy clearing, particularly that kind of energy clearing. Those are what I see. How much mold exposure has there been? How much Lyme exposure has there been? Those are the 2 biggest triggers and traumas. Those would be my top 3.
It's fascinating because the trauma and then being safe and the polyvagal nerve, I mean, it all ties together. And I work a lot with ancestral trauma, and that is actually something that is even passed on the DNA. So if you have grandparents that were in World War II, their trauma and their fears are then passed on to the younger generations. And they've done studies on mice, and the offspring of the mice, even they artificially inseminated the female mice with a sperm from the male mice that was given an electric shock when they smelled cherry blossom. Those mice pups were then more jumpy around the cherry blossom smell, even though they had never smelled it. And so we know that it gets transferred down, and it makes sense, because if the ancestors also had different sensitivities and traumas, and then the next generation is more wired for looking out, being safe, being on guard, and then coming in and maybe having hives and things early on in their childhood, and then something else happens, and then everything sort of hits the fan, because it sort of becomes like an overload. And then maybe also picking up Lyme and
you're already primed when you come in with those. And I wanted to circle back and add, I mean, there's so many populations we could talk about, but our Black communities are also, there's so much of this, and they're so underserved in this area right now.
So anybody that's listening thinking, oh my gosh, maybe this is what's wrong with me. Maybe I have MCAS. Is there anything they can do or take any steps to sort of figure out if this is their problem?
Absolutely. Well, one, we've talked about some heavy stuff. So to know that what it took me 75 practitioners, well over 15 years, and I stopped counting at $350,000 to do and a turnaround, doesn't take that anymore. And there's so much more advancement that's happened. People are getting better much more quickly. There's a lot of hope. and a good reason for it. And I have confidence that the vast majority of people, if they're willing to work, it's work. There's no like single pill, or easy fixes, but vast majority of people turn this around and they get their lives back and they go on. And so if any of this sounds familiar, or you're somebody who goes practitioner, and nobody can put the pieces together, and you have 5 specialists on your team, or you have sensitivities. Not everybody has sensitivities, but if there are sensitivities to chemicals or foods, medication, supplements, I have a symptom survey on our website, and it's based on the research of the symptoms that have been clearly linked with Mast Cell Activation Syndrome. And there are many more, but I wanted to bring it out of some validated research. And it's free on our website. It's super easy to do. You just count how many of these symptoms you have. There's a little key at the bottom. So the more symptoms you have close to 50 or above, you should definitely look into it more. It's not a diagnostic test, but it's telling you, am I in the right ballpark? And they'll find out on our website at mastcell360.com. And just under MCAS, there's the symptom survey link.
Well, that is very helpful. And what if they think that, well, there are certain foods that I eat and I seem to get anxiety or sort of panicky after I eat certain foods? Do you have any information on your website about different kinds of foods?
We have a lot of information. So we have a very well referenced and researched histamine list. That's a great place for people to start, is to start with the histamines. Many people I see, I would say maybe half, have multiple types of food sensitivities, but people aren't really severe. Histamine is a great place to start. And then if you want to look more in depth, we've got stuff on oxalates and salicylates and FODMAPs and lectins. These are other things that can trigger mast cells, but it's not as common. Histamine is the big one. We have a ton of recipes that are low histamine, and they are all medium oxalate, low lectin, and we have some low salicylate and low FODMAP recipes as well. So we try to hit these various needs. And I'm a bit of a foodie, so they are delicious recipes. They're not ho-hum recipes. They're quite tasty and good. So we have those resources as well. And then we have some courses if people are ready to take the next step.
That's wonderful. It's such a wealth of information, and it's so hard to find the information that is on your website. And also when people eat a gluten-free diet and they're hoping that, maybe by going gluten-free, they're going to fix all their symptoms. But a lot of the gluten-free foods, the replacement for the gluten is actually high histamine food. And so I've seen some people getting worse and then realizing, you have a mast cell activation syndrome.
Yeah. And oxalate. So if there's leaky gut, there's more likely to be oxalate issues, or there are mold issues. And so oxalates are these crystal-like structures that can lodge in our joints and the tissues. And that's what kept me on the cane. When I lowered my oxalates, which people have to do very carefully, please read the blog post and don't go cold turkey, because you can trigger kidney stone. And I've seen people end up in the ER. Please read the blog post about how to do it if you're going to look at it. But I was off the cane. I had replaced the gluten with almond flour. I was doing a lot of buckwheat, and then I was eating seasonally. So I was eating beets in the winter, Swiss chard, and spinach, which is high histamine and oxalate, and making things like spinach smoothies, which I don't think anybody should be drinking now. But not that spinach is evil, just it should be a condiment, not a main course. And we've made it a main course. And so people can navigate through those. And then if you have a lot of sensitivities and you can't take any supplement, the nervous system course I developed especially. Everybody can benefit from it, but I've really developed that for people who are struggling to tolerate taking things. And people are curious about mold. Our mold class course has gotten a huge amount of positive feedback to just break it down, make it easy to step through.
Wow, that's just wonderful. Such a wealth of information. And I just want to thank you so much for taking the time and being a guest on the podcast today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.